We are the group from MCOE, offsite, and we're going to be presenting about multicultural counseling. And we're going to be talking about suggestions for incorporating a multicultural perspective into your counseling. And my name is Lauren. So a brief outline of what we're going to go over. We're going to start by talking about multicultural competencies. So we're going to do a class activity. Then we're going to talk about multicultural competencies as they relate to social justice, the debate about multicultural competencies, worldview and identity development, methods of evaluating counseling theories, and then guidelines for incorporating a multicultural counseling into your practice. So the multicultural counseling competencies were actually developed when members of the American Psychological Association challenged the profession to identify standards of culturally competent counselors. And then the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development responded by creating a set of multicultural counseling competencies. And there are 31 competencies, and they provide guidelines for clinical practice. And now Alex is going to talk about the first set of guidelines.
Hello. So my name is Alex, and I will be talking about counselor awareness and values and biases. From the research and the literature, the optimal method of promoting counselor awareness of values and biases is through self-assessment. Self-assessment helps promote the awareness of values and biases by identifying counselor strengths, weaknesses, attitudes, and beliefs that can promote or inhibit the counseling process. Self-assessment can occur through various avenues such as personal counseling, as well as tests or other counseling strategies that help counselors identify or get information about their self-concept, personality, interest, values, aptitude, or other important aspects of their self. Self-assessment supports improving counselor qualities of being encouraging, empathetic, caring, flexible, and non-judgmental, which are qualities that help facilitate the core pillars of counseling, which are unconditional positive regard, self-disclosure, empathy, and respect. So now, with that being said, we're going to go into a little activity to help us gain awareness of our values and biases. So with this activity, we have 6 big post boards on the side of the room, each with its own distinction of races or ethnicities written at the top of it. So right now I'm going to ask my fellow group members to go to these boards or to these post-it papers and write worldviews, stereotypes, or prejudice regarding each of these groups, ethnic groups, that they have either heard of, observed, or just are aware about. This is, again, just to build and gain knowledge of our own awareness and of our biases. So remember, non-judgmental. This is totally a learning experience and a learning exercise. So each of you have markers. So I'll give you guys 5 to 10 minutes, and can you guys please go? Remember to say space, guys. Or ladies, really.
Oh. Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
You can circle or underline with if you've heard of it or familiar with it. You're familiar with it.
They're very similar.
Okay, so given the activity and all the comments and statements that are written on each of these post-it papers, to you guys, which one of them stands out to you guys from any of the post-it papers?
I think for me, just looking at the Native American and its alcoholics, it's highlighted and then underlined quite a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's all, pretty much all negative.
Right, yeah, it's all negative.
Spiritual
Well,
is positive.
Spiritual
Yeah,
is
that's true.
Yeah, and
Mostly negative.
sometimes depending on how you view superstitious, it may or may not be positive.
So where do you guys feel that this stereotype or this prejudice or whatever it was created or where it's rooted from, and how we're all very familiar with it?
I think it's from the history.
The history.
Their history, how their land was taken over and how they were essentially supposed to be taken out of the whole entire
Right, I agree. I think it's the history. That's kind of what we know and what we've seen even on pictures or TV, movies.
Yeah.
I think in some ways lack of exposure to this culture has created stereotypes that aren't true because Native Americans aren't really, the communities of Native Americans aren't really widespread.
That's true.
And so maybe a lot of the information people have on that culture comes from, fictitious things like movies and shows.
Yeah.
Right, because they lost a lot of their history and their culture when people were coming over to this land. So, I mean, a lot of it was word of mouth. They didn't have a lot of written down.
So which other ones stand out?
This
for
one
you?
kind of stood out to me because there was a lot.
Okay, so for
For
the
the Latino, the Chicano,
Latino.
Latino.
Okay.
Like, I feel like that one stuck out, and a lot of it, I don't know. Could it be some of these two kind of stick out?
Illegal and undocumented.
Because that's like a lot of people in California, and not even just California, all over. But it's often we associate it with Latinos and Latinas, but we also don't associate with other cultures. There's a lot of other cultures. Like there's Asian Americans, some African Americans maybe. There's a lot of other cultures that are here illegally and undocumented, but we always pinpoint it to the Latina culture. So
at least for us here, because of the area where we live in, we are more exposed to the Latino culture, so maybe we hear more of those things.
But if you could see, we go through the same process. We come here, we're going to be fixing our papers. They have to go through the same process in immigration, but it's not well known as,
the other
cultures.
And even
the Dream
like,
Act and AG 540, there's a lot of.
And like what usually makes the national news is Latina culture. That culture usually makes the national news. You don't hear about, someone from the Philippines came here illegally. Or you don't hear about, someone from Europe came here illegally, or Canada, or anything. You always hear about the Latina culture. You don't hear about anybody else on national news. But there's everybody from every culture.
Yeah.
There is somebody here illegally.
All of us came from a culture that, originally had to immigrate here and, become legal and all that kind of stuff. But because of the area we're living in, the largest group of people that have immigrated here currently in this area would be Latino, Latina. And so that's probably why we hear about it more. There's not like a ton of Filipino immigrants in Monterey County.
Exactly.
I think another thing that goes with that is because we live next to Mexico, and that's where a lot of the immigration occurs.
Yeah,
And you hear about deporting and just like crossing over. So I think that has a big impact on.
So
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So I have a good question because, I mean, obviously I think this end stuck out, and we have Latino and African American on this end. And then on this end we have white, European American, and Native American. And as some of you guys, maybe some of these are bad, but some of them are good. But why is it so? I guess why is it more that over here we have more bad connotations of stereotypes than we do, and we have a lot less here?
I don't know. The KKK is pretty.
It is. It is. It is pretty bad. No, that is pretty bad. But in terms of look how much items
I
are
think
in here.
it goes back to what we were just talking about. It's the area we're in, and so we're going to be exposed to this more than as opposed to someone who's Native American or European American, because majority of this area, because of the migrant farm workers and where we're at, this is what we're most exposed to.
Well, I think this one too is very generic because we could have broken it down to Italians, French, Spaniards, you know, so.
Would you guys think that maybe education? Because see, right now, this one I think predominantly would remain to current affairs, right?
Yeah.
Current political stance. Whereas I feel that also kind of relates into our education system. I mean, if you look at our education system, we learned a lot about European and like American history and European history versus anything current affairs in our education system. Would you guys believe that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we learned that white is good and black isn't, you know, so even if you look at the movies, it's always like the white princess, and I think that even here we can see it.
It's always the lighter skin is better than the darker skin.
And even in the individual cultures, it's the same way as well. Like even in the Latino culture, if you're light skinned, you're also considered, you know, ooh, we're gonna save this one for wellness.
Right. My dad used to call my little sister his little sack of flour because she was so light skinned, and then she started going to school and she became dark, and I don't know, it was just kind of weird to hear him call it that.
I think that's a good point that actually I want to talk about in terms of there is this taboo with being white. Even I guess if other people consider you white, I think there's this taboo. If you ask white people, so to speak, what their culture is, some people will say, I have no culture, or others will say they're European, of some European descent, right? As far as that, I mean, with Mexicans, if you're the light-skinned Mexican, you're the güero in the family, and you get, if you're African American or black, if you're light-skinned, you're shunned upon even like that, like you said, my sack of flour, and I think that's interesting in terms of there's a big taboo in being white, but yet essentially we all try to accommodate to being white, right? Like, I don't know. I think that's just interesting. So thank you. And I guess what the purpose of this, really what this assignment is and this activity is that these are all, you guys are all aware of this. You guys all wrote these statements and these prejudices and these stereotypes on here. So these are all prejudices and stereotypes that coming into whatever school site we go to or whatever populations we work with, they're battling the same, or they're facing the same stereotypes or aware of the same stereotypes that we have to acknowledge, and also just know that that's what we're facing. There may be some others that are not even on here, and I think it's just good to be conscientious of them.
So I'm going to be talking about the second part of the multicultural competencies, which is the counselor's awareness of the worldview of their clients. And I'm going to use an example scenario to kind of illustrate how I would use these competencies and these guidelines to better serve my students. So let's say, for example, that I am hired to work at a school where the student population is predominantly Asian American from a low income background, and I myself am from a white middle class background. So how would I use these guidelines to work with students who are from a very different population than my own? So the first part of the competencies is attitudes and beliefs. So I would want to do an activity like the one that we just did to examine my own preconceived notions about Asian American culture and points where it might prove detrimental to working with my students. So for example, in the activity that we just did, one of my preconceived notions is that Asian American parents often tend to be, as the term is, tiger moms, that really push their children very hard and pressure them to follow a certain path. So whether or not that's true, that is a preconceived notion that I have heard before and have experienced a little bit. So then working with a student and thinking about working with that student's parents, based on my own beliefs and my own upbringing, my parents were not like that. They were very supportive, and they said, you know, we'll support you in doing whatever you want to do, whatever path you want to follow, whatever major you want to have in college. So very different upbringing. So thinking about how would I work with a student and their parents if they came into my office and said, no, my child has to do this, this is it, and kind of how would I work from a non-judgmental point of view in helping them communicate with their child and communicating with that parent and not automatically thinking, oh, they're wrong because they don't think the same thing that I do, and thinking about understanding where they're coming from and taking the time to understand possibly why they have that viewpoint. The second part of this multicultural competency is knowledge, and that is gaining specific knowledge about the culture and about the culture of the person that you're working with. So again, in this example, I would want to gain specific knowledge about Asian American culture and understand how the culture might affect maybe my students' vocational or college choices, but also the manifestation of psychological disorders. If I'm going to be the counselor working at the school, I need to understand some warning signs of these students and when I might need to step in. So for example, when I was working at Berkeley, I went to a conference and I attended a session that was talking about South Korean students, international students studying at Berkeley. So the session was about Asian American students, well, more specifically about South Korean international students studying at Berkeley, and how it was put on by a mental health professional from the Student Health Center. And he was speaking about how these students often feel a lot of pressure to do a certain major, make a lot of money, do well in school because their whole entire family has financed their Berkeley education, and they're expected sometimes to go home and earn a lot of money immediately so that they can pay their family back and support them. So these students a lot of times are, because of that pressure, very anxious, depressed, but they don't reach out and they don't ask for help, and it's often very insular culture. And so he was speaking to the staff members saying, you need to be aware of how these students might be acting, know that they're not going to come ask you for help, pay particular attention to the warning signs, and possibly just keep an eye on them if they're in your class or you're working with them as an advisor, and kind of take into account these things and maybe ask, you know, kind of put the effort in to help them. So this could definitely be applied to working with high school or middle school students as well, understanding certain psychological disorders and how they might manifest in different students. With regards to knowledge as well, it's also important to understand how socio-political influences might impact our students' self-esteem and their view of themselves. So understanding some influence such as immigration issues, poverty, racism. For example, an activity that we did, somebody wrote down illegal for Latino students, and thinking about, okay, that's a stereotype for that population, but there are also a lot of Asian American families and whose parents are undocumented as well, and understanding how that might be affecting your students if their parents are going through an immigration issue. The last part of this part of the multicultural competencies is skills, and this is about actively seeking out educational experiences in order to gain knowledge and enrich your cross-cultural skills. So one way that you can do this is definitely by taking the time to study abroad and travel. Our department offers opportunities to study abroad, and this is, you know, even though it may not be in the culture that you're primarily going to be working with, it's transferable skills that you can take to work with many different populations, cross-cultural communication, incredibly helpful. Another option would be seeking out conferences where there's going to be sessions on cross-cultural competency. For example, I looked up the California Association of School Counselors, their annual conference this year. One of the major things is cultural competency, and they're going to have 7 sessions specifically on that topic. So it would be a great opportunity to go learn, talk to others about how they are working with people from different cultures and enhance your skills. Finally, with skills, it's not just about gaining an educational perspective, but actually fully immersing yourself in the community where you're working and taking the time to gain a personal perspective as well. So attending events, lectures, volunteering in the community, building relationships, friendships. And this is really the more you immerse yourself in a community and understand where your students, your clients are coming from, the better you're going to be able to build trust with them, and then the better you'll be able to work with them. So now Sarah is going to talk about the next part of the competencies, which is multiculturally sensitive interventions.
Okay, so because the culture can affect a client's, their culture can affect their behavior and also can affect the counseling process deeply. It's important that we are very aware of and cognizant of how our clients fit into, or which cultural background they fit into. So starting at the top, attitudes and beliefs, it's really important to respect bilingualism. For example, in my job currently, a lot of my students are bilingual, and I make an effort to provide information for families in both languages so that people can access the language they're most familiar with or most comfortable with. Respecting spirituality and religion is extremely important as well. One of my students this year is Jehovah's Witness, and for that reason she cannot celebrate any holidays or birthdays. And so I have to be sensitive to this throughout the year, although other students may celebrate it, and as holidays come and go, I may provide activities for that. I have to remember to keep in contact with the mother and make sure to be just aware of it and respectful and to not violate any of those boundaries. Lastly, in attitudes and beliefs, it's important to recognize Indigenous helpers in the community. So this may be somebody that's important in the community to a certain culture that might not seem important to somebody else that's not familiar with the culture. So it's extremely important to be aware of what individuals exist in what cultures, and this may even take a little bit of research on the counselor or the educator's part. Nextly, knowledge. We really need to work hard to keep ourselves aware and educated about these different parts. Clashing a traditional counselor and culture. For instance, in some cultures, as a female counselor, it may be highly inappropriate for me to have strong eye contact with a male client, and that might be something that culturally would be seen as disrespectful or maybe even just inappropriate. And being aware of these kinds of things allows you to avoid and be respectful of different traditions and appropriate social behavior that may exist. Institutional barriers that minorities might face in accessing mental health services. Again, being aware of that and being able to go around those barriers and help people to have full access. Family life and community resources varying cross-culturally. Identify how discriminatory practices may negatively affect the client. Like we talked about in our group activity we just did, we saw that there might be several different stereotypes that could make people feel badly about themselves. For instance, I think on the Asian American poster we had on there, good at math. It may actually be something that a student feels so negatively about themselves if they're not good at math, feeling like they've failed their own identity. So it's important to realize these things and even make students aware of them and realize that individuals have their own strengths and weaknesses, and culturally these types of stereotypes are negative and mostly not true. Lastly, skills. Using appropriate verbal and nonverbal communication. Again, different cultures have different gestures, different eye contact strengths, as well as different personal space lengths. Culturally, some cultures have a very small distance between an individual and themselves, and that would be seen as normal, while other cultures feel that if you step within that personal space bubble, that it is very disrespectful or even just really uncomfortable. So it's important to recognize things like that. Using interventions to help with racism and discrimination. Back to the same thing about trying to get rid of some of those stereotypes and be aware that they could make people feel pressures that are unnecessary. Opportunity to express themselves in preferred language. Respecting bilingualism is probably just about the same thing. Making sure that people have access to their language of strength so they feel they can communicate properly and access knowledge and information as they go through the counseling process. Assessments needing to be culturally sensitive as well. A lot of assessments aren't built for cultural differences. They're built for one type of individual with certain experiences, and references in different assessments can be very unfair and confusing and things that students may not be exposed to. So it's very important to realize those differences and, if possible, to edit and modify the assessments to match the student's background. Addressing the issues of diversity that may create bias in evaluations and interventions. Again, back to maybe examples of, just for instance, if it were, say, a comprehension assessment, the story that's being read may have several references to situations the students never encountered and isn't culturally relevant whatsoever, all the way down to maybe the characters in the story, the names, maybe names that they're not familiar with whatsoever, and can create a lot of confusion. And so it's really important to match it to something the student is aware of and experienced with in order to make it a fair assessment. And lastly, to empower clients to have an active role. So that has to do with the relationship between the client and the counselor being strong, and making sure that these things are plans that you've made together, and that the client has a strong voice in how they feel about different parts of their culture and their existence as a person, and making sure you're sensitive to all those things. And next, Priscilla will be talking about multicultural competency and social justice.
Okay, so the definition of social justice is to address social political forces such as cultural oppression that undermine human rights. So in terms of multicultural competency for that, it's Vera and Spite believe that competency should be grounded in a commitment to social justice and requires counselors to go beyond their role, which includes social changes. Some of the activities that they can do with the students is maybe provide books on human rights as well as social justice, and maybe even some writing activities that could help the student broaden more and learn more about what social justice is. And then a lot of times the feminist theory is used, therapy is used to help students. It's used to address issues of social justice, and it promotes social political action to overcome oppression and gain equality. And clients are often encouraged to challenge the privilege in the dominant society in order to promote the equality and empowerment and advocacy, as well as being able to be included in the society. So that, I'm going to turn it over to Juliana, and she's going to talk about the multicultural competencies debate.
So my name is Juliana, and I'm going to be talking about the multicultural competencies debate. So it has been an ongoing debate as to the validity of the multicultural competency in the advancing of the practice in counseling. So according to Wetredge and Thomas, there's no empirical evidence that the counselor who masters the competencies would be better than one that doesn't master them. They argue that the competencies are faulty in terms of content and assumption. They also they cited a personal communication from von Stress. And according to von Stress, the competencies are restricted in the development to the 4 national minority groups. These are the African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans. As if the culture is owned by just this 4 groups, right? The writers of the multicultural competency seem to take this just on the racial ethnicity view of the culture, with the emphasis on the difference, which brings people apart instead of bringing them together. And also, pattern states that multicultural competencies are not necessary and can be misleading and counterproductive. He states 2 problems to this. that positive counseling outcomes are much more important than the matters of knowledge and skill associated with the multicultural competency, and that there is a mistake to assume that clients' differences are more important than the similarities that the individuals might have, and that they each require a different approach. That could be a problem. Therefore, they believe that counseling, the multicultural competency are not as as important as bringing the groups together, and their concern is just that they want to work on the individual. But as I am, a Latino background, I know that it's hard for me to share my experience with someone that has gone through life without struggles. I'm referring to instead of having a counselor that is Latina, I had a counselor that she was white. Even though she was a great counselor, she couldn't identify much with the struggles that I was experiencing, being first generation in my family, being a teen mom, because like she said, my experience has been, my parents were supportive, I went to school, and didn't have the struggles that you have. I'm not saying she wasn't not capable of doing her work, but she also let me see that it is important to be able to be aware of the struggles that other ethnicity groups are going through. Therefore, there is a need of the multicultural competencies. And if this debate continues, there should be more, dialogue between these types of people that are against it, to see that there is a good result when you incorporate and you learn about other cultures. And now it's going to be Jen and Melissa.
Hi, I'm Jen. In order to understand the client as a unique individual and provide more sensitive and effective counseling strategies, it's important to be aware of the client's culture and their worldview. Worldview is a construct that can be used to individualize the counseling practice. So when we meet people, we need to understand that we're looking through certain lenses, and so are other people. So what we make of people and what we see in the mirror when we look at ourselves depends on what we know of the world, what we believe to be possible, what memories we have, and whether our loyalties are to the past, the present, or the future. Worldview refers to an individual's schema. It's consistent with his or her cultural framework, and it extends beyond culture or ethnicity. It has a direct effect on the client's ability to solve problems, make decisions, and resolve conflicts. The person's schema, or worldview, deals with their culture's orientation and relationship to ideas, such as human nature, the natural world, spiritual beliefs, the universe, and other philosophical issues that are concerned with the concept of being, such as, for example, a person's worth ethics, their child-rearing practices, their personal boundaries. Our worldview helps us locate our place and rank in the universe. And as a counselor, our knowledge of a client's worldview and of our own worldview may promote more sensitive and effective counseling strategies. When two people from different cultures communicate, both of their worldviews need to be understood in order to establish rapport and trust. Ibrahim and Khan, in 1984 and 87, created a scale to assess worldviews, the SAW-V. It's a 45-item instrument using Likert scale responses, and it has 9 items per subscale to measure an individual's valuation of the following 5 universal or existentially universal categories, which are human nature, if we see people as good, bad, or a combination of those. The way we view our social relationships, if it's linear, hierarchical, or individualistic. The way people view nature. Do we want to subjugate and control nature, live in harmony with nature, or accept the power of nature? The way an individual is oriented to time, the way people view the past, present, and the future. And lastly, their activity orientation, if they're being or doing. And this SAW-V is the items have proven reliable and the construct validity has been proven. And right now I'm going to turn this over to Melissa, who's going to talk about identity development.
Hello, my name is Melissa Gonzalez, and I'm going to talk about identity development. So identity development is a process of integrating and expanding one's sense of self. So a counselor's role in identity development is to help the client clarify and enhance their self-identity. So this should be a central task in counseling the client. So there are several models of identity development which help explain how an individual forms an identity, such as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, white Americans, or biracial Americans. So Myers and colleagues have noted that racial ethnicity identity have developed models have limitations. For example, they may not take into account multiple oppressive factors such as socioeconomic status, minority status, or multiracial backgrounds. Myers and colleagues have developed the optimal theory applied to identity, so it's listed above, which also is a consideration of multiple oppressive factors and is based on worldview rather than being restricted to racial ethnic considerations. So there are 7 phases. So phase 0, absence of curious awareness. Phase 1, individuation. Phase 2, dissonance. Phase 3, immersion. Phase 4, internalization. Phase 5, integration. And phase 6, transformation. So in phase 0, individuals lack a sense of self as separate, self-awareness, and they develop this around ages 1 through 2. Individualization. So individuals adhere to personal identity generated by family and society. So basically what they're exposed to. Phase 2, dissonance. Individuals begin to take into account others' opinions. So that's when, this person believes this person believes that. And if some may be negative and they're more accepting of that. They have their own opinion. Phase 3, immersion. So individuals who feel devalued by others may immerse themselves in the ways of the devalued group and react angrily towards the dominant group. So they begin to have negative behaviors. Internalization. Individuals incorporate a number of important aspects of the self in formulating their personal identity. This broadened self-image enables them to be more tolerant and accepting of the criticisms of others. So they start to be stronger in their personalities and in their own opinions. Phase 5, integration. Individuals begin to gain a deeper self-understanding and change their assumptions regarding the world. Phase 6, transformation. The self is redefined. I have my own opinions and I stick to them. So the individual appreciates the interrelatedness of all aspects of life and incorporates a spiritual awareness regarding the order of life in the universe and fosters a sense of wholeness or completeness in the individual's psyche. And that's identity development.
Hello, my name is Silviana Sanchez, and I will be talking about the methods of evaluating counseling theories. The EDCO and EMIC model are terms usually linked to linguistics. EDCO is universal to all cultures. For example, in rational emotive behavior theory, the concept that irrational beliefs contribute to negative emotions would be universal across all cultures. EDCO concepts must be truly universal to be successfully applied to different cultures. So in the example of REBT that I just mentioned, REBT does not consider that meaning that the meaning of irrational beliefs may vary from culture to culture. EMIC is culturally specific. This is a phonemic concept, which is something unique to a particular language. EMIC refers to concepts that emphasize individuality. In the example of neuro-linguistic programming, which is a connection between neurological process, language, and behavioral patterns learned through experience, and these can be changed to achieve specific goals. The EMIC concepts encourage counselors to treat all clients as individuals, which avoids prejudice or stereotyping tendencies from the counselor's part. The common factors model by Fisher, Jones, and Atkinson. For this model, it contends that all counseling is multicultural and that a framework is needed to address universal health conditions in a culturally specific context. This model can be used to address EDIC and EMIC perspectives. The factor model in counseling is that it can address both the EDIC and EMIC perspectives. The therapeutic relationship is across all cultures, and the key word here is therapy. All cultures, it's suggested that there's a relationship between two people, and it's across all cultures. The shared worldview is a common ground between counselors and clients. There might be a difference in what that worldview means to both, but there is mutual respect for each other's perceptions of the world. The client expectations. So the client has to be comfortable and believe that the counseling will be effective in order for them to benefit from it. And for ritual or intervention, the counseling practice has to be culturally sensitive in order for it to be effective. This model of common factors model is a framework in counseling conducted from a multicultural perspective. Counselors should ask themselves how they can contribute to building a client's relationship, how they understand their client's worldviews and perceptions of distress, and they should also try to raise clients' expectations and being able to implement culturally relevant interventions. And now Claudia will continue with methods of evaluating counseling theories.
Hi, my name is Claudia Aguilar, and Silviana was saying I'm going to talk to you about the acculturation theory. And this theory really is a measure of extent of adaptation to the costumes and values of the host culture. And if you can see, here are some visuals, and one of them is made in the U.S. with Mexican parts. It's really that's what it's saying, is you are becoming part of a new culture, but keeping your own culture as a part of it, so it becomes one. One of the things that right now just happened is the Happy Thanks Hanukkah, which is the first one in our lifetime that has happened. It was the first time for Jews that Thanksgiving and Hanukkah came in the same day. And the last picture that you see here is they're becoming American citizens, but this person is dressed with her cultural attire. So that's really what we're talking about. It's associated with the degree of change, behaviors and cultural awareness, cultural loyalty, and it's between the native and the host culture. And this area in particular, for counselors and research, it has a lot of room to grow. It's promising a lot of research, as it's something that it's new as we, as a nation, continue to become more diverse. So counselors can actually measure acculturation by examining some important factors, and those can be educational level, it could be socioeconomic status, it can be the length of the time in the U.S., as well as their exposure to racism. And one of the things that I was able to read, and part of the research, is that a lot of clients tend to go through acculturative stress, which is a psychological impact of adjusting to the new culture. And it usually is at the beginning of their process of trying to bring in a new culture. And it really impacts their physical health, it impacts their decision making, and their occupational functioning, as well as just their overall being of who they are. Another counseling model that I'm going to talk about is Usher's model, which uses the 10 faulty assumptions identified by Peterson to determine whether a traditional counseling theory can be used in multicultural counseling. So if we recall earlier in the chapter, those are misconceptions of normal behavior, the emphasis of individualism, fragmentation by academic disciplines, the use of abstract or out-of-context concepts, overemphasis on independence, the neglect of the client's support system, dependence on linear thinking, the focus on changing the individual, not the system, the neglect of history, and dangers of cultural encapsulation. And an example that is being used is Rogers person-centered counseling. And so they're really trying to compare what are the cons and pros when using this with a multicultural client. So the pros are that with Rogers' self-person counseling theory, the clients define the goals and they determine the evaluation process. So there's less of a chance of their feel judged by others, and mainly by their dominant culture. Some of the cons are the emphasis on individualism, independence from others, and the belief that locus of control and responsibility resides within the client. That's really a con, because some of the things cannot be controlled, like poverty. You know, these clients, especially in some of these groups, do go through poverty. They experience it, so it's difficult for them to really control that. So these are the pros and cons that these models are talking about. And that was my part, and I will hand it over.
All right. So my name's Flor, and I'm going to be presenting on the guidelines for multicultural counseling. So there's 10 guidelines. The first one is to establish mutual respect. Mutual respect is the foundation for all relationships. It is necessary to create a healthy relationship. It is especially important when counselors, when a counselor is from the majority culture and is counseling a minority culture. So establishing a cultural equality is important because a client might feel like they're being looked down. So I think by establishing an equal culture, they are more willing to participate. Another way to create mutual respect is to honor their unique way of perceiving the world and communicate acceptance of their client. The second guideline is not imposing one's own belief system onto the client. Each culture is, we live in a very diverse country, so it is important that we accept, understand, and are tolerant to the different cultures that there is. The third one is treating the client as a unique individual first, and then seeing them as a person from a different culture. A counselor must see clients as individual and unique, like their unique characteristics, and to avoid basically stereotyping or any self-defeating process.
The fourth guideline is the counselor must determine if the traditional counseling approaches are appropriate for the client. So Claudia talked about the 3 different methods to determine if they are basically appropriate for the client, which was acculturation theory, Usher's model, and the EDCO model. The fifth guideline is counseling services must be accessible and dependable. So services must be adequately staffed so that the client basically can know that there's always going to be someone available for them and to serve them at the time that they need it. Services must be welcoming to everyone. So sometimes the client might feel like their problem is not big enough, or like they're getting in the way, or they just don't want to be there. So it's very important that counseling services are like very welcoming to everyone so the client feels comfortable. Now, Veronica is going to go over the last 5.
My name is Veronica, and so I'm going to cover the next guidelines for multicultural counseling. Okay, one of the things that's covered in the book is that we need to be extremely flexible and change our approach depending on who we're working with. So for example, depending on where we work, our clients may have different needs, such as food, shelter, or safety. So we need to become action-oriented and focus on the present. And an example that I have for that is that I have the opportunity to work at a high school. And just recently I was working with a student who, he has a lot of family issues and problems at school, but one thing that was affecting him now was that the fact that he didn't have any clothing, and career day was coming up. So he needed pants, and I had to do something in order to help him. So I had to get the student clothes, and I told him I would try to find an agency or some place that would donate the pants that he needed for career day. And I was able to do that. So that brings us into the next bullet that's on here, which is being a doer, not just a talker. A lot of times we're perceived as just somebody that you can go talk to, but not really that's going to help you with current things that are affecting you. So if you say that you're going to help with something, or that you can fix a student up with another agency or resources that we have in the community, then it's very important that we actually make that connection happen. Now, as far as environmental assessment, it's important to explore differences in cultural factors. So, for example, working here in Salinas, we work with a majority of Latinos, and one of the problems that we constantly face is that parents expect their kids, females, to stay at home and form their families, get married, and not really continue on with their education. So sometimes as counselors, we need to learn how to work past those barriers, and not only with the students, but also with the parents and the entire family. So one thing that's mentioned also is that it's very important to take this as a learning experience and to be enriched by the culture, and take advantage of all the things that we can learn from the students and just the community that we work in. And we can do this in different ways by either, if we're not, let's say, for me being Mexican and working here in Salinas, it's not much of a difference from it's not a difference at all from my culture, but maybe for me to learn about a different culture, it would be a good idea to go work somewhere completely different. Another way of learning is also just reading or going to art exhibits. I mean, it mentions like this whole list of things that we can do in our book. So just really taking advantage of the situation and using it to discover and explore a lot of things that we are unaware of. And then the last thing that's covered on there is that we don't have to be a minority to work with a minority. So all it requires is for you to be sensitive of others' needs and their uniqueness, and to gain as much knowledge of their beliefs, knowledge, and skills. So covering this whole chapter about multiculturalism and counseling was or is very important because we live in such a diverse country that it's constantly important to be learning about other cultures and learning how to work with families and children that are completely different from us.